The moving truck pulled away, leaving behind silence, fresh boxes, and the smell of cut grass that clung to the air after a long summer day. For David, this was supposed to be the first chapter of a quiet life in his new neighborhood. He had bought the house after months of searching, drawn to its wide yard, mature oak trees, and the promise of peace away from the city's chaos. Everything about the property whispered potential, from the overgrown hedges that could be shaped into something neat, to the backyard that could one day hold gatherings and memories. But that peace lasted less than 24 hours. The morning after he moved in, David stood on his porch, coffee steaming in hand, watching the golden sunlight pour across his lawn. That's when he noticed them. A group of 4 people in matching polo shirts with clipboards were walking straight into his yard as though they owned it. Their expressions were sharp, their strides filled with purpose. It was his very first interaction with the homeowners association. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They simply began circling his yard, pointing at patches of grass, jotting notes, and shaking their heads disapprovingly. David felt his chest tighten as he realized these strangers had no hesitation in treating his property like an inspection site. He had barely set his furniture inside, and already he was under scrutiny. One of them tapped at the mailbox, making a note. Another bent down, tugging at the edge of the lawn where weeds had sprouted. They muttered things to one another, loud enough that David caught phrases like "out of compliance" and "violations everywhere." For a moment David stood frozen. He didn't know the rules here, didn't even know this subdivision had an HOA that operated this aggressively. He had heard stories of homeowners associations before, groups that nitpicked over paint colors or fined people for leaving trash cans out, but he hadn't expected to face it so soon, and certainly not with this intensity. As he stepped off his porch, the group barely acknowledged him. One raised a hand as if to silence him before he even spoke, flipping through papers with the HOA's letterhead. They treated him not as a neighbor, but as a problem that had already existed for years. They pointed at his fence, declaring it needed replacing. They gestured at the trees, claiming branches extended too far toward the sidewalk. Even the garden bed, where flowers had just begun to bloom, was criticized for not being community standard. Within minutes, David realized this was not a warm welcome. This was a storming. By the time they left, they had tacked a yellow notice onto his door. It listed preliminary violations, with fines that could escalate if not corrected immediately. David stared at the paper in disbelief. His first day already poisoned with hostility. Yet something gnawed at him. He remembered details from the purchase paperwork that now felt more important than ever. There had been mention of the HOA, yes, but also an odd clause about the neighborhood's community center, their headquarters. A clause that gave him, as the new property owner, full rights to the land where it stood. At the time, he hadn't paid much attention to it, assuming it was legal jargon buried in the documents. Now, as the HOA paraded away, smug in their control, he began to wonder just how much power he really had. The day ended with an uneasy calm. Boxes remained unpacked, but David couldn't shake the image of strangers trampling across his lawn, dictating what was and wasn't acceptable. His home no longer felt like his. Yet, deep inside, a seed of defiance had been planted. He wasn't about to let this association dictate his life without a fight. As he lay in bed that night, the yellow violation notice still pinned to the door, David decided he would read every page of his purchase documents again. He would know exactly what he had bought because maybe, just maybe, the HOA had no idea what storm they had walked into. The war between homeowner and HOA had only just begun. The next morning, David sat at his dining table, papers spread across the surface like a battlefield map. The soft hum of cicadas drifted through the open window, but his focus never wavered. He combed through every page of the thick binder he had almost ignored during the purchase process. Mortgage forms, title transfers, and buried among them, the section on the community association and its facilities. There it was. Bold, legal, undeniable. The community center, the building that served as the headquarters of the HOA, was built on a parcel of land that was included in his property purchase. The paperwork spelled it out clearly. Ownership of the parcel had transferred directly to him. The association leased it under an agreement that expired in just 6 months, unless renewed by the property owner, him. David leaned back in his chair, stunned. The very people who had marched across his yard with clipboards and smug authority had no idea that their headquarters, their place of power, was already under his control. In their rush to intimidate him, they had overlooked the one truth that could upend their empire. The thought filled him with a mix of anger and amusement. They had stormed his yard like conquerors, yet they were trespassers on land he owned. He could feel the irony settling deep inside him like a weapon waiting to be drawn. But timing was everything. If he revealed this too soon, they would scramble to find a loophole. If he waited, he could let them dig their own hole, burying themselves in arrogance. That afternoon the HOA returned. This time more members had joined. A caravan of cars lined the street, and neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the polo-clad enforcers marched toward his property once again. David noticed how quickly whispers traveled in this neighborhood. He was already being painted as the new guy who doesn't follow rules. The HOA president, a woman named Carol with sharp features and an even sharper tone, stood at the front. She was the kind of leader who thrived on control, her voice carrying authority even when unnecessary. She announced to everyone within earshot that David's violations would not be tolerated, and fines would escalate if he refused to comply. Neighbors murmured in agreement, afraid of becoming the next target. The HOA thrived on fear, and Carol wielded it like a weapon. David stayed quiet, observing, his hands steady despite the storm brewing in front of him. He didn't defend himself, didn't argue, didn't even raise his voice. He simply let them write their notices, stack their papers, and issue their threats. Because deep down, he knew something they didn't. Later that evening, he drove past the community center, the so-called heart of the HOA. The parking lot was empty, its windows glowing with dim light. It looked more like a fortress than a welcoming place. Yet David couldn't help but smile as he parked nearby, pulled out his paperwork, and stared at the building. That fortress was his. The deed in his hands proved it. The realization carried a strange sense of power. For the first time since moving in, the frustration of being ambushed in his own yard began to fade. Instead, it was replaced by strategy. He didn't just want to defend himself. He wanted to dismantle the culture of fear that had taken root in this neighborhood. But how? He couldn't just walk in and throw them out, not yet. He needed to wait for the right moment, one where their arrogance would make their downfall undeniable. So, David began quietly observing. He noted the HOA's patterns. When they patrolled, who they targeted, how they exaggerated small issues to collect fines. He spoke casually with neighbors, hearing stories of families bullied into silence, of people forced to repaint their homes at outrageous costs, of elderly residents fined for weeds they could no longer physically pull. Every story fueled him further. This wasn't just about him anymore. The HOA wasn't a group maintaining order. It was a machine built on intimidation and money. And they had no idea that the foundation of their machine sat in the palm of his hand. As another violation notice appeared on his door, this one demanding he repaint his shutters, David didn't tear it down in anger. He pinned it to his refrigerator instead, like a growing collection of their arrogance. Each notice was another stone he would use against them when the time came. The war was no longer about a yard, a fence, or weeds. It was about exposing an empire that believed itself untouchable. And soon, very soon, David would show them just how fragile their power truly was. The stage was set, the players in motion, and the storm between homeowner and HOA was about to break wide open. Weeks passed, and with every passing day, the HOA piled notice after notice onto David's door. The yellow slips became so common that neighbors whispered about his house as if it were cursed. Carol, the president, made it her personal mission to turn him into an example. She announced fines in community meetings, exaggerated his violations, and painted him as the stubborn newcomer who disrespected the neighborhood. What she didn't know was that David was collecting every notice like evidence. He was patient, quiet, and deliberate, waiting for the moment when their arrogance would finally collide with reality. That moment came during the HOA's quarterly meeting. The community center was packed. Residents filled the chairs, some supportive of the HOA out of fear, others resentful but too afraid to speak. At the front, Carol and her board sat proudly beneath the association's banner. Stacks of files lined the table, lists of fines, complaints, and penalties against homeowners. David arrived last. He carried a leather folder under his arm and walked straight to the front without hesitation. The board tried to silence him, declaring he was not allowed to address the room until his violations were resolved. But instead of raising his voice, David opened his folder, pulled out the deed, and placed it on the table for everyone to see. Silence swept across the room. The documents clearly showed that the community center, the building they sat in, belonged to him. Gasps echoed among the neighbors as Carol's confident expression faltered for the first time. David explained, calmly and firmly, that the land and building had transferred to him when he purchased his property. The HOA was only leasing it, and their lease was set to expire in just weeks. Once it did, they would have no headquarters, no meeting hall, and no place to operate. Their so-called fortress was his to reclaim. The neighbors erupted. Some laughed in disbelief. Others cheered, finally seeing a crack in the association's armor. Years of resentment poured out as people realized the HOA was not untouchable. The fear that had hung over the community began to dissolve right there in that room. Carol tried to recover, her voice shaking as she threatened legal action. But the paperwork was ironclad, undeniable, and witnessed by dozens of homeowners in the room. Her authority slipped away like sand through fingers. For the first time she had no control. David didn't yell, didn't gloat, didn't seek revenge. He simply announced that when the lease expired, the HOA would no longer be welcome in the building. They could either disband or find somewhere else to operate, on their own dime. The room roared with applause. Neighbors who had been silent for years stood up and clapped, grateful someone had finally challenged the machine. Some called it justice, others called it overdue, but everyone knew one thing: the HOA's reign of intimidation had ended. In the weeks that followed, Carol resigned. The board scattered. Without a headquarters, without fear to fuel their power, the HOA collapsed under its own weight. The yellow notices stopped appearing. Lawns and fences returned to being just that. Lawns and fences. Families began to enjoy their homes again, free from constant surveillance. And David, he finally unpacked his boxes. His house became a home, his yard a sanctuary. What had started as an invasion ended with liberation, not just for him but for the entire neighborhood. The irony was impossible to ignore. The HOA had stormed his yard the day he moved in, blind to the truth that he already held their fate in his hands. Their downfall wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, inevitable, and just. So what do you think? Was this justice? Did David do the right thing by waiting and striking when the moment was perfect, or should he have revealed his ownership sooner? In the end, the HOA got a taste of its own medicine, and the neighborhood finally found peace.